My section is was about exactly what the title said, the economy. He explains what economy has become over the years. The purpose was to get people to understand what he thought economy was and why he wanted to live in the woods. A quote to support this is a pretty long one. How many poor, immortal souls have I met while nigh crushed and smothered under its load, creeping down the road of life, pushing before it a barn 75 feet by 40. Its Ogden stables never cleansed, and 100 acres of land, tillage, mowing, pastures, and woodlot. The portionless who struggle with no such unnecessary finds its labor enough to subdue and cultivate a few cubic feet of flesh. But men labor under a mistake. He talks about how the labor is not worth it, and that's how he supports it. I do agree that sometimes the labor we do is not worth it. The way we work hard, and when we get what we want, finally work for. When we finally get what we worked for, it doesn't feel like we deserve it. Sometimes we work so hard for something so little.
Or anything.
If you can go up and interact, so that way you're getting next to the TV.
So for my presentation was Economy Part 2. For the purpose of section, after finishing reading my section of the story Walden, Economy Part 2, I have come to realize its purpose of showing the society life of the main character of other people's perspective when living in society with interacting with one another. Even with describing the difference between two groups of people, the ones living in wealth but are somehow still poor, and the other who are poor but seem to be living in a rich poor life. Quote supporting purpose and how they support it. The main character of the story compare the two from living through three classes divided by poor, middle class, and upper class. Upper class to the other group of an indigenous group of people who lived by their own rules, making their homes by what God has bestowed on the land given to them for free. He decides to leave everything behind, to live in the woods by Walden Pond, to start a new life away from it all. He has said that it appeared to me that for like a reason men remain in the present low and primitive condition, but if they should feel the influence of the spring of springs arose in them, then they would of necessity rise to a higher and more ethereal life. These were the differences of the two groups, the pros and cons of his people and the indigenous people, which the indigenous people had more pros than the other group. Sections aboutness. My section talked about the main character's people's lifestyle and fitting in society from the way they dressed and how wealthy they were. It wasn't just the American people that he talked about, but also others such as the indigenous people who they saw were called savages and yet seemed to be having more better life than the other richer people were. It's stated in the text saying, but how happens if that he who is said to enjoy these things is so commonly a poor civilized man, while a savage who has them not is rich as a savage, meaning in a way that even though the indigenous people were poor, they still lived a comfortable lifestyle than the people who had money, wasting it on luxuries, clothing, housing, to still end up struggling. Personally for me, I would agree to live in the lifestyle the main character chose to change from his previous life to live on his own in the woods and provide for himself, because I wouldn't want to live in a society where you were rich but yet you were still struggling to survive just to make ends meet. Plus somehow it was back then in the day, people were struggling just to live in a decent small house when the men built a simple small cabin home to live a peaceful lifestyle yet still interacting with other people. Thank you.
So I had Economy Part 3, and my section was basically about the process of Thoreau moving into a new house in Walden, and he describes the process of settling in, which includes building a new roof, a chimney, and creating his own food supply in the form of a few choice crops. And he also does, throughout the section, he does little calculations and provides information on how much it costs to build a new house and how much growing the crops were. And however, throughout the section, he also makes several quips about how pointless it is to build these material objects and fawn over them when we should be focusing more on like the power and the spirituality of the human mind. So the purpose of the section is to educate the readers on the contrast of living a trapped, boring, materialistic lifestyle that focuses on obsessing over complicated and physical objects in comparison to living a life that's free, simple, and adventurous that focuses more on simpler methods. So some of the quotes that supported that purpose, I have two here. One of them is, with 100 modern improvements, there is an illusion about them. There is not always a positive chance. Our inventions are wont to be pretty toys which distract our attention from serious things. They are but improved means to an unimproved end, an end which it was already but too easy to arrive at. The second quote is, I cannot but think that if we had had more true wisdom in these respects, not only less education would be needed because, forsooth, more would already have been acquired, but the pecuniary expense of getting an education would in a great measure vanish. This is the last slide of quotes that I have. The third quote was, what does architecture amount to in the experience of the mass of men? I never in all my walks came across a man engaged in so simple and natural an occupation as building his house. We belong to the community. And the fourth quote is, it should not be by their architecture, but why not even by their power of abstract thought, that nations should seek to commemorate themselves. One piece of good sense would be more memorable than a monument as high as the moon. So the way they support it, quote 1 describes how big, heavy metal improvements appear to help people when in reality, their existence doesn't really have any meaning since it turns out there's no real help it can provide. And they essentially spend all their time and money working on a project that just has no real meaning to it. Quote 2 describes how complicated ideas like education would be a little simpler, people focus less on the standard routine of college courses and more on enlightening the mind with less standardized, more natural methods. In addition, he argues that if more minds were taught to absorb more information with these methods before going to school, it would eliminate the need for superficial things like tuition money, because we all know we need money to have college tuition. Question 3, quote 3, it questions the obsession with tangible and material objects, pointing out that we shouldn't focus solely on material objects because he says it brings no real joy or satisfaction to a human soul. So he's explaining again that nothing satisfactory comes out of building something tangible. Quote 4 states that instead of remembering like society or a nation or a country for something superficial like the size of our buildings, so for example, the US has the Washington Monument, we should focus instead of the strength of our minds, the strength of our brains, and this fixation on rejecting the obsession with monuments and supporting the idea of the mind's importance, it ultimately just rejects and throws out the idea of materialism. So I did agree that sometimes new inventions and announcements that take really long to build, they sometimes have no real purpose, like the high-speed rail that we're building, when we could be using that to build more dams or preserve more farm water. However, I do disagree with Thoreau's perspective that students should lay out the foundation of education on their own because as a way of showing their independence, because high school students may have used that privilege and make us just like only have 2 days a week of school. Lastly, I partially agree with the idea that nations should be remembered by how brilliant their minds were instead of how big their statues were, because architecture is still an important part of a nation's culture. It represents their individuality. But material objects shouldn't be the only thing that stands out when we remember a country. And that's it.
Thank you.
Okay, I got part 4 of economy, and I think the purpose of the section was to show how self-reliant he was and how materialistic he was. In this part, he goes into detail about how he grows and harvests his own food and his minimalistic life, and how he thinks society should run. First, he describes his frugal way of living and how he goes without certain ingredients because he would either have to socialize with the town, which quote he says, "Thus I could avoid all trade and barter," and then he goes without, or he could just harvest them himself. Then on the next 2 pages, he goes on a tangent about how small his collection of furniture is, and he believes that the more you have of such things, the poorer you are. He then writes about how when you die, your objects aren't burned or purified, instead they're sold. And what he thinks should be done is a thing called bust, where the town gathers all their old belongings, and this should be a week-long event of cleaning and purifying, and including fasting. He thinks working is unnecessary and unreasonable. He believes that he shouldn't be forced to dress up to work and conform to what society believes. And when he did do trade, he thinks trade curses everything it handles, and the whole curse of trade attaches to business. He believes that business cannot be found in work, or freedom cannot be found in work, and he has no desire to work for luxuries. It's not necessary that a man should earn his living by the sweat of his brow. Lastly, he mentions that he doesn't believe that everyone should follow what he has decided for himself. Instead, he believes that each person should pursue their own path and not someone else's. Overall, I believe he tried to convey that the more items you have, the more you will want, which will lead you to being more poor, and being as self-reliant as possible with the sacrifice of some goods.
And my section was where I lived and what I lived for. So my section was about the Real finding a perfect home for him that would give him a life of freedom. We started off with him giving up Hollow Out Farm because he felt that it.
And sorry, just a really background. She was doing the Where I Lived one, so it's I think she was right after economy when that took place. So it was towards the beginning of just getting there.
Was not out of control of the government as it was in the woods. We also see many passages of his love of reading, very classical texts. So basically the purpose of this section is, I would give the title. The title is the purpose. Where he lived is what he lived for. And I also quote, "I am monarch of all I survey," because this tells us that he lives in the woods and everything he sees is everything that he owns. And I'm going to shorten this quote, but basically he says, "I went to the woods because I wished to live desperately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could learn what it had to teach, and not when I came to die, discover that I had not lived." He wanted to see if he could learn anything else that would otherwise not learn in our society that would basically teach us everything that we should learn. But he wishes to learn other things that we would not otherwise learn. And he felt that if he did not learn those, he basically did not live. So a very, very good quote on his mindset, I say belief, is simplicity, simplicity, simplicity. He states that 3 times, which tells us the importance of it. And he also produces exclamation marks. So this tells us that why he is going into the woods. It's for the simple life. He's the monarch of all he owns, which makes it very easy. He does not have to
do paperwork about what he owns. He doesn't have to show proof of those things. He wishes to do something, he does not have to ask for permission and all those things. My opinion is that I quite disagree with Thuriel's point of view, although I do think that him going into the woods is a very great way of seeking the life of freedom that he wishes, just like Chris from Into the Wild. But his point of view of humans is that they are very mechanical. They have a habit of repeating what they've done before. And I do think that, yes, this is quite tiring to just continuously do what you've been doing, but we live in such a society that speed is everything, and habits are what makes us go fast. And he also shows that you must relent, legal deeds, legal things, which we now, everything has a legal thing. This is basically because humans have made errors before, and we need to show our legal proof in order to show that, yes, this is what we can do, this is what we can owe, this is what we earn, all those other things. So this was it on my section. Thank you very much.
So I had this section reading, and mine talked a lot about how he thinks education is really important to our society. So for the start of the section, he talks a lot about partaking in media in its original state, and he kind of goes on like a tangent of like how poets like from olden times are really the only ones who will fully be able to understand their poems, or like works that are written in Greek will only be able to be fully understood if they are read in Greek in their original language. And then he talks about how even though those words are interpreted better in their original languages, they can travel and be interpreted in different ways, and how important words are to our society. And then in the second half, he highlights a lot about the importance of getting a higher education, and he believes that not one person should ever stop like furthering their education. They should always better themselves educationally. And so the purpose of this section is he was focusing a lot on like the small town that he used to live in, and talking about how he felt like they didn't further their education as much as they should have. And he was focusing on telling them to get it as much as they like possibly can, and not stop like trying to better themselves. And so one quote I found that kind of ties into the beginning of it. He said, "A written word is the work of art it's nearest to life itself. It may be translated into every language, and not only be read by actual breathe from the human lips, not be represented on a canvas or in marble only, but be carved out of breath itself." And then I thought this one really tied into how he was saying words are by far the most important part of our society, because of how we communicate with each other, and how we can interpret things that like maybe books from the past that we couldn't be able to look at otherwise. And we can help ourselves grow and others grow through the potential through words and stuff. And then the second quote I found, which kind of talks about how he finds education important, he says, "I confess I do not make any broad distinction between the illiterateness of my townsmen who cannot read at all, and the illiterateness of him who has learned to read only for what children and feeble intellects." And this one kind of like degrades people who only go a certain point in education, who don't try to push themselves as farther as they can. And so this one, in my eyes, was the one that really highlighted him wanting people to push themselves as farther as they can, because he talks about how they only will like get an education up until like the smallest point that they can, and then they won't further it. They'll just go into like a career or something. And he wants people to go and learn as much as they can. And so in my eyes, like I agree that people should actively try to better themselves in education, but I didn't agree with him like looking down on people who chose not to, like who chose just to go into a career and not further their education as much as possible, because it's not our place to judge what people want to do with their lives, and it's not our place to like belittle them. And that's it.
This is about the awareness of the surroundings, the imagery and the sounds. It talked about how peaceful one thought his world was, the nature blowing the grass and trees, birds calmly flying, and the easy breeze. It was all interrupted by the noises that came with them. Soon he hears the loud whistles of a train, the screams of hawks, and the calls of crows, and the peaceful breeze that shook the trees. What its purpose was. The purpose of this story was to let the reader know, to find out what stands before them, to get the reader to become more aware of their own faith. I believe this because of the opening of the story stated, read your faith, see what is before you, and walk into futurity. Some quotes that I found, the first one, both from paragraph 1, read your fate, see what is before you, and walk into futurity. And then the next quote is compared with discipline of looking always at what is to be seen. They support my claim by proving that the reader must read to find out whether he is an observer type or just a listener type, or perhaps even both. It helps the reader to think and maybe interact with themselves to see if they'll take initiative and become more aware as to the sights as well as the sounds around them. I do agree with the story's intended purpose, as it had me thinking, am I someone who likes to listen more or observe more? Just as the author in the beginning, I felt connected by just observing. It related to me because I wasn't an easily focused student. The question had me wondering what type of person I truly am, a reader, a student, or a seer. The end.
Hello everyone, I was tasked with reading the chapter Solitude, so here's my presentation on it. So Solitude is a story about Walden being alone in the forest by himself, living in his own house with very few people around. He stated that there was no one for miles around, and he talks very greatly about his life and how much he enjoys all the delights of being alone in the forest, in a sense. And even though the main take of it, the story is to be alone, he emphasizes more on how great human interaction can be, in a sense. So I would say the purpose of Solitude is to explain the benefits of being alone, in a sense, and what meaningful interaction can be of benefit to all of us. And there's a few other subpoints that were kind of described throughout the story, such as what it really means to be alone or have solidarity, as he kind of explained, even in a room full of people, you can kind of be alone to yourself. It's not about distance, but more or less distance of minds. He also kind of explained the benefit of having like a purpose or kind of like a justification for why you're around or what you're doing. And the other sub-point that I would say he was also trying to say is how great a life among nature can be, and to live more naturally than to live in a more societal way. And he kind of does all this through elaborative situations and speculations throughout the story, talking about, well, imagine if kind of this happened, or imagine if you did that, or what if things were this way, in a sense, or what if this is how things are meant to be. So the two main quotes I chose was his take on society, which he kind of explains that we don't really give each other the time of day that we really should in trying to talk to one another. And through that quote alone and through the following paragraph with it, he was explaining the very importance of having meaningful interactions between each other so that we can get better with each other. And kind of described this almost a little bit kind of like you social insects, in a sense. That's kind of what I got from it, how we're just climbing and swarming over each other, not really caring about being near one another, not really having a sense of individuality for each of one of us. And then the second quote he kind of talked about was the solidarity part of it, because I would say that in the story there's the duality of being with others and being solitary. And he emphasized the importance of being alone and how you can better yourself and really understand yourself by being alone, and that being around others all the time will kind of devalue in a sense, which kind of reminded me of the saying, absence makes the heart grow fonder, which I thought was very in tune with this story. So overall, I would say I very much agree with all of the topics in this story. Solidarity is a great tool for getting away and being able to have mental clarity so that you can take on stuff and become a better person and really develop yourself, so that when you get to the second part of what he was saying, of having meaningful interactions with people, that you're really someone that people want to be around and be fun to be around. And that kind of, in a sense, we're kind of hollow and shallow with people when we interact with them sometimes, not really having meaning behind what we say. That's the end of my take on solidarity.
Okay, I'll be presenting the chapter Visitor. The section, what I believe the section was about is the showing of the lifestyles of different people. So the section is about Thoreau, and he's living in a forest and he has many visitors. That's what this chapter is called, Visitors. I believe the purpose of this chapter was to give into detail of Thoreau's point of views of his visitors, but most importantly, the views on special individuals. And one of the special individuals is Alex Therian, a worker nearby. So there's multiple quotes in this chapter, but these quotes are quoting Thoreau's views and how he sees Alex. So the first quote is, "He interested me because he was so quiet and solitary and so happy without." So he interested Thoreau because Alex was really different. So another quote that shows the difference is, "Such an exuberance of an animal spirit had he that he sometimes tumbled down and rolled on the ground with laughter at anything which made him think and tickle him." So Alex was he was a weird dude, different compared to others.
Sorry, really quick, just so you know that this is about Henry David Thoreau, right? It's not about McCandless.
No, it's Alex is the worker that Thoreau sees.
Okay. I guess I was making sure that you weren't. I'm just making sure you weren't conflating the two. Okay, continue. Sorry.
And this guy Alex Therian was a different dude compared to everyone else. And these quotes kind of tell us what Thoreau sees as seeing him. So the third quote is, "But the intellectual and what is called spiritual man in him were slumbering as an infant." So what he means is Alex was like really a spiritual man and he acted like an infant, if that makes any sense. Another quote that shows Thoreau's view on Alex is, "Wiser men were demigods to him. If you told him that such a one was coming, he did as if he thought that anything so grand would expect nothing of himself, but take all the responsibility of itself, and let him be forgotten still." So what he means is Alex didn't see himself as anything special, but Thoreau, seeing that Alex could be someone special. But Alex is acting like an animal, as stated before by Thurl, and also an infant. An important quote is, that Thurl said to the reader is, "To a stranger he appeared to know nothing of things in general, yet I sometimes saw in him a man whom I had not seen before, and I did not know whether he was as wise as Shakespeare, or as simply ignorant as a child, whether to suspect him of a fine poetic consciousness or stupidity." So what Thurl explained here was that Alex Therian is, he acted like he was either really smart. Going back, what I believe this section was about is Thurl's view on like the difference of people. There's how there's so much different people. And on this quote right here, "To a stranger he appeared to know nothing of things in general, yet I sometimes saw in him a man whom I had not seen before, and I did not know whether he was as wise as Shakespeare, or as simply ignorant as a child, whether to suspect him of a fine poetic consciousness or of stupidity." So this quote here is explains or showing Thurl's view on Alex Therian, a worker nearby that lives nearby his house in the forest. And Thurl's view on him is that he's really smart, but he's also really dumb as a child. If that makes any sense. And on this last quote right here, from Thurl, he said, "I could not but notice some of the peculiarities of my visitors." So what that means is he could not but notice the differences of the people, like of the visitors that come to him in his house, or like at his house in the forest. If that makes sense. And so how do these support my purpose? So these quotes are telling a part of the story on Thurl's view and his viewpoint on Alex. And the explaining of Alex's everyday life and how Alex views his life and how he lives it. The differences of Alex and how he's smart or dumb, yet he's really strong-willed. With more visits from many other individuals, each person has some sort of goal. Each person had a different lifestyle, and with Thurl's view, as they visit his house, he experienced many different people. So what I disagreed with is that, so Thurl believed that Alex was an infant or an animal with a lack of education. Yeah, I believe that Alex was living the life that he enjoyed the most. Someone's lifestyle shouldn't be judged, is what I believe. And that'll be the end of this presentation.
Thank you. Okay, so we talked about, like, again, the reading one a little bit. So the last one that right? Yeah. Yupeng did and Jack did kind of go a little bit together, because his was about solitude and his was about that one specific visitor, Alex Therian. And the thing that you guys need to kind of be aware of is that, again, like I said, he's kind of a flawed person at times, because he's saying on one hand that you should have perfect solitude, but at the other hand, he really makes this connection with this Alex guy. And the thing with Alex, though, is that he's just like Thoreau. He likes to be in the woods. He likes to do his own thing. He's kind of like a hermit also. And so he's okay with human interaction as long as it's someone just like him. Kind of makes him a little bit of an egomaniac, because it's like, oh, this person's perfect because he's just like me. But also too, think about daily interactions you have with people, especially when you meet new people. If you go to a party or something and you meet new people, what's one of the first things that you usually ask somebody?
What's your name?
What's your name? What else? What are some?
Where are you from?
Where are you from? Or when you get to be in the adults sort of section, what do you do for a living kind of thing is always the normal go-to small talk kind of stuff. And that's what he's kind of saying is he wants genuine human interaction. So even though he's picking someone who's just like him, he's at least forming a real human connection, and it isn't just like a superficial, I'm gonna make small talk because it's a socially acceptable thing to do, it's polite, you know, it's like when you guys talk to me because you feel awkward if you don't say anything to me, it's kind of like that, you know. So it's like, he's wanting us to like not make interaction just because society expects us to, but because we want to have real meaningful experiences. Because again, that's what transcendentalism is. It's about real experiences that are meaningful and trying to get rid of everything that is either superficial or shallow or whatever, or just like doesn't like add any value to your life. Okay, so that's kind of like where everything he's talking about kind of all comes back to that. Meaningful experiences. Okay, let me see who is next. I might have one actually. I might have the video one from Kat, so let me see if she submitted that. And if she did, I'll just airplay it. Of course, her last name is the last one. There we go. Well, I'm not sure where she put it. I thought she said she was going to post it on Canvas, so I just messaged her, so we're going to skip her for one more presentation at least. Okay, so we should be going to... I just lost my spot. Okay, so Andrew, we're going to go to you next. So Andrew wants you to all know that he thought what I did to him was very unfair. I gave him 2 sections because they were technically shorter sections. So he technically is going to go over 2 different purposes. So he actually had to like do twice as much of that. But he had about the same amount of reading. So that's why it happened that way. But I appreciate you picking up the slack. So thank you, sir. Sorry. I'm a terrible person. I will burn for eternity. I got it. You're fine. Audrey thinks the same thing, or at least that's what the video was like. She did last night. She was ready for me to die.
So my 2 sections were the bean field and the village. So each section, the bean field was about 7 pages long, and then the village was about 3. So the bean field was about the art of nature husbandry. In short, it's what, when you're taking care of a farm, you not only apply modern, it's not modern, you apply everything to it. So it's like, you have to think about like, you know, animals are going to come in and eat your crops. Weeds are going to come in and ruin them. And it goes through the author's, bean field, for which he meticulously cares for, and it kind of gets a little obsessive with them. As well as being concerned with the shortcomings of it all, like pests eating it and weeds coming up. He does it in he makes crops in a very unorthodox way. If you read most people he sees like working every day, and when they pass him, he's like, he just started now. Like, people are kind of bewildered by him teaching. He also goes on to mention that people have lost the way of old husbandry, like of doing it the natural way, and connects us to the farming, saying that we were born with everything that is right and true. So people nowadays have been trying to focus more on quantity rather than quality, and we were born with that quality and we should stick with it. So the village was about the author's experience with the village he lived near. He told us how gossip is able to move at an alarming pace, inhabiting anywhere and being told to everybody. he described it, I forgot how he described it, but a traveler could not go in there unless they like went the back way. They would at least hear the gossip once. He goes on to say how when it gets like very, very dark and he's trying to go home, he doesn't rely on sight, but he relies on feel. So I guess that you can consider that his instincts. And lastly, he talks about when he was jailed, been released, but still trusts the people around them, although he does condemn the haters. So the purpose of the being field is to show that the reader that the ways of old were thoughtful of everything and had a way of dealing things about themselves. Because back then people were like, oh, well, if this happened, well, it would take care of itself. Nowadays people want to micromanage and control every little thing, and that has changed. So people are now more about sustenance, meaning the amount of something, versus the thoughtfulness, which is the quality, I guess you could say. The purpose of the village is to show the reader how something very familiar can instantly change when one factor changes. Like let's just say, I know there'll never be a blizzard here, but let's just say there were a blizzard. You're so used to the way Sinker looks like, but with the blizzard, you're not going to know what it looks like. And he connects it to the person, in which case, for people's unpredictability, we can still learn to trust them. So the quotes I used was, husbandry was once a sacred art, but is pursued with irreverent haste and heedless by us, our object to have large farms and large crops merely. The true husbandman will cease from anxiety and finish his labor with every day, relinquishing all claim to the produce of his fields, and sacrificing in his mind not only his first but his last fruits, and that was on page 6. For the village, often in a snowstorm, even by day, one will come about a well-known road and yet find it impossible to tell which way it leads to the village. And then it continues, I was seized and put into jail. I never fastened my door day or night, though I was to be absent for several days. At one point, he was gone for 2 weeks in Maine, and he never had his door locked. So, how do the quotes support the purpose? For the bean field, this past quote supports the purpose because it explains how the quality of old is being changed for the quantity of new. It goes much deeper than just farming. People are becoming much more about their own ways than the ways that are best in the world. And the latter way is the way people should lead. We worry too much with the new without letting the old take care of it itself. So like I said earlier, nowadays we want to be nitpicky about everything, but back then, if something happened, you kind of just let it play on with itself. So for the village of the snowstorm and being thrown into jail, I know they don't seem like they connect, but I try making it connect. This quote supports the purpose of this section because it shows that however familiar, one little variable can change the familiarity instantly, like the snowstorm. And despite that, when it comes to other people, we can still learn to trust them. After all, we are still human and everyone in this world makes mistakes and needs to learn to put others first. So people are flawed, yes, but we still need to learn to trust them because everyone is flawed and makes mistakes. So do I agree or disagree? So the texts were very confusing, okay? He rambles on a lot and you can be like, oh, really? Then why didn't you just say that in 2 sentences? I can agree with the ideas that were laid out. The world has become selfish, and the old ways had a way of taking care of that, so less selfish. So one part that I didn't mention is like with the farming, people used to have like Thanksgivings, they used to have holidays, they have this and that. Nowadays, that doesn't happen anymore because, well, people are more about quantity versus just enjoying the way life has for us. And also, people can change, but that doesn't mean we have to be a recluse. You can still trust people no matter how bad they are. So I said, these ideas are good to keep in mind, but they're not good ideas to live by, as you can see with what happened to Chris McCandless. Thank you.
Yeah, so definitely, I agree with you, Andrew. He does ramble, and he goes on. Somebody had said it earlier, I forgot who it was. I left it in their comments, but he goes on lots of tangents. Have you guys had to read William Faulkner at all? Any of you guys, like, you've read Faulkner? Okay. at some point. He's known for a style of writing called stream of consciousness. And stream of consciousness is like, if you guys struggle with Thoreau, he's like on Thoreau on crack, basically. It's pretty much like periods don't exist to him. Like the punctuation periods don't exist because it's like stream of consciousness is basically just these like long he'll have like a sentence that'll last like an entire page. It'll technically be grammatically correct. He'll have like commas and semicolons and stuff like that. But it's like these like huge rambling sentences that are like so insane. It's like, what are you talking about now? Like it's hard to keep track of. So just be thankful that I'm not making you read Faulkner is all I'm saying instead of Thoreau. But and also be thankful that I split it up and not had you read the entire book too. Because this was like in the Google Doc it was like 228 pages that I divided up amongst all of you guys. So anyways, okay, I think Diego that you would be next. Let me double check. Were you the pawns? Yeah. Okay, then yeah, you're gonna be next. Okay, technical glitches aside, we're good.
I think so. They just say they would make this out.
Alright, so in the ponds, Thoreau kind of goes through his like routine of living like at Walden Pond, and then what he usually did was just go into the middle and then just play his flute and look into the sea. Into the pond. And then he describes it in like great length and like just mostly about like the spirituality of it and like how it was very clear and he thought of it as pure. And then he speaks of the other surrounding ponds and he thinks of them as like very like corrupted and like because they're dirty and like the shores aren't as clean. So he really like puts Walden Pond on like a pedestal of what he thinks it should be and then how every single pond should be. And so then because of this, he kind of makes it as like a metaphor for the purity of like nature and what it could be. And then also he thinks that because of the purity of the pond, that when he's on it, he feels like integrated between his functional self, which is like what he sees in the metaphysical world, and then the spiritual connection to the earth. So in one of the quotes, he says, when he casts his line up into the air, as well as into the element, he can catch 2 fishes as if it were with 1 hook. So it's like, he's basically saying that when he's on the pond, he's basically as spiritual as he is living at the same time. And then he thinks of the pond as God's tears, and then as like a remnant of before Adam and Eve like sinned, and then so basically he wants a pure world, and then like a heavenly celestial deity. So he wants it to be very pure and not man-made. And so then I disagree with the narrator's view of reaching divinity through the means of purification of the soul. I don't think like the perfection of the soul is like a prerequisite for the fulfillment that nature can bring. I don't think you need to be a perfect person to like truly like fishing or just being in nature. And I also think that like the perfectionism and like trying to be a god is unattainable and it's just not healthy. And you can kind of see that like with the other people's, how he only liked that one person because he was like him. So he thinks of himself very highly, just because he's not like other people. So I think he just tries to be like, just thinks of himself too highly. And yeah.
Excellent conclusion. And love
Okay, my chapter was the Baker Farm. Whoops. Okay, so during this chapter, Rue is out fishing when a storm comes, so he has to go find shelter. So he goes to a hut by the Baker farm, and he thinks he's alone, but then he finds out that John Fields and his family are staying there, and they are Irish immigrants. They start talking back and forth, but the conversation isn't really a two-way conversation. It's more of a lecture from through to the Fields. And he's just saying how they should be living their life, and he basically tells them that if they reevaluate their priorities, then they wouldn't be in the financial situation that they are in. So he brings up things like coffee and meat and other materialistic things because it takes up too much of their already small income. And so he claims that he only means well, and he's trying to teach Fields, but Fields is really uninterested in what he has to say. So Thurl just leaves, but before he leaves, he asks for a water. But when he drinks the water, he closes his eyes because he knows that the water is dirty and below him. So he leaves the hut and continues to make comments about how the Fields are leaving as he's walking out of where he's coming from. Why are you looking at me, Andrew?
No, it's just the guy thinks he's better than everyone else. That's what I'm like.
Okay, so the purpose of this chapter is to basically show how he views people according to his own beliefs. He believes that he is above basically everyone, but especially this specific family because they are immigrants, and because they're Irish, he also ties that into why he is above them. And he also describes the woman and her kids in like a rude way when they're the ones that are offering him shelter. The author just wants, so the purpose is to show us just how raw his thoughts are towards others, and it shows that he's not really aware of empathy. Yeah. Anyways, these are quotes that I found. So basically the first quote is him describing the women and the child that they have. So he calls the woman a round, greasy face and bare-breasted with a never-absent mop, yet has no visible effects. So he's basically saying that their house is dirty, but the woman always has a mop in her hand, so something's not right here. He also goes and says, enjoy the land, but own it not through the want of enterprise and faith. Men are where they are, buying and selling and spending their lives like serfs. So what I took from this quote is that basically that they're like working every day trying to like just survive, and they're on this land but they never really get to own the land, so they're just falling into like the herd of sheep of
Slavery.
yeah, basically. Next, do I agree or disagree with this guy? Honestly, I don't agree with how rude he is towards people. I don't agree how he thinks that he's above everyone else, but something I do agree with is the fact that how he sees the working world having to work and like slave away to support yourself, but never really gaining the independence that you kind of like want when you're, because, so yeah, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
One more that at least your presentation was finished and you're up to any slides, so we can pick up on that. Yeah, sure.
One moment where someone
Well, I feel like he wouldn't write about himself being profiled or having fun because he wants to see himself as
True. Again,
so if I were writing about myself, I wouldn't write about myself too.
basically Walden's like everybody's like Instagram story is like him just presenting the best version of himself, essentially.
I love that.
Yeah.
I was like looking at like, why are you like me like that? Because I thought you were like looking at me because I said something wrong.
It's okay. It's like Van Gogh, the row. Yeah.
Macy, Andrew didn't read, so he wouldn't know if you said something wrong.
True. He didn't read that
The only one who would know was the teacher. He probably read the whole book.
I just said how we didn't like him based off of that summary.
Make jokes too. We know you got jokes. We heard you in first period.
Wow.
Andrew got jokes.
He did.
Andrew doesn't know his jokes though.
Andrew wasn't joking around. He just says it and we take it as a joke.
Yep.
The row is the roo.
Oh my god. That was bad.
I don't get it.
Yeah. The row is the roo.
Okay, Isabella. Okay.
Okay, sorry, Val.
Okay, so hi, my name is Isabella Jimenez, and the chapter that I got was called Higher Laws, and it is in the book Walden by Henry David Thoreau. However you pronounce it. So the summary of the chapter is basically returning from John's field cabin. Thoreau spots a woodchuck, which is a bird, and is briefly tempted to seize and devour him raw. He wants to consume the animal's wildness, not its flesh. He wants to go into the wild to arouse him to fishing. Thoreau begins to give up fishing and starts to feel ashamed of eating fish. He states in the chapter, should both sit down at the same table. One should not disapprove of one's food. He says that bread or potatoes are as sustaining as fish, with less trouble and filth. Thoreau then states, the wonder is how you and I can give this slimy, beastly life eating and drinking. He's not squeamish about the food itself, but about his appetite. And at the end of the chapter, he can push away his greed or his other sensual appetites, so he will have to practice some new austerity to redeem himself. So the purpose of this chapter is that the narrator is declaring the superiority of spirit over nature and the incompatibility of spirituality and animality. In this chapter, the world of spirit and nature are put at odds. While spirit is higher than nature, the narrator will not give up his vital relationship with nature. He must reconcile the difference between his spiritual instincts and his animal instincts. Thoreau's conclusion is that the consumption of animal flesh is unclean. The necessity to catch, clean, and cook meat in order for it to be eaten is not worth the trouble. So here are some quotes and how they support purpose. So ranging the woods like half-starved hound with a strange abandonment seeking some kind of venison which I might devour. So the quote is very important because the narrator qualifies these somewhat extreme remarks by telling his readers that he was not literally hungry, but that he did strongly desire the experience of wilderness, the strong feeling of animal existence in nature. So the second quote that I found is, I found in myself and still find an instinct toward a higher, or as it names, spiritual life, as do most men. This quote is important to know because he spends the rest of the chapter explaining how his mindset of animality is not only interior, but in conflict with his desire towards spirituality. We are all sculptors and painters. This is the third quote. We are all sculptors and painters, and our material is our own flesh, blood, and bones. This quote is important because the body may be fashioned into fit a certain way for the interior spiritual self, and how the animal flesh and bone is the same as a human. So something I agree and disagree with. So I agree with the author about the concern of eating fish or any animal food in a wilderness. It's a lot of hassle to have to cook and clean the fish in order to eat it. You also don't know if the fish animal has any disease, but there's also a counter argument that the meat is in fact a natural state of man, but I don't agree with that. Eating fish and animal meat is much different and could be dangerous and a lot of hassle. And that's my presentation.
All I could do was remove the entire time because you guys not mentioned it. Your whole teacher thing was like, oh, such BS. Because first of all, you would have known about the doctor's appointment, I would assume, at least the day before.
Yeah, I was.
So if you didn't say anything to me about the captain, I had to call you and ask you, like, oh, were you dropping or are you just...
No. So I had woke up late. It was like 8:30 and I was like...
Yeah,
He's filming confirmation.
Yeah. That I just scheduled right now.
No.
You nervous, Hannah?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, zoom through this.
This is
Whoa. Hannah. Hannah.
Like on your shoulder,
Jen,
right?
you need to be, you don't have humor. You need to be funny. That's when you
And we're all your friends. We're all your friends here. You talk to us all the time. You talk to us all the time. Well, I mean.
Alright, guys. Alright, we only have a few more to get through, so let's try to wrap these up. Alright.
Okay, so the section I had was called Rude Neighbors. And before I start, I read this a bunch of times because my opinions kept changing. So if you get a little lost, I'm really sorry. Yeah. Okay, so the section was about two main characters. There's a guy named Hermit, and he likes to go fishing, and Poet, and like the first 5 times I read it, I thought it was a figment of Hermit's imagination because he kind of like overanalyzed and brought it into like a poet kind of thing, and he's like, oh this and oh that. But after reading the section a few times, I started to notice that the character might be the loon, which is a bird, who likes to go out like when Hermit's out there fishing. And the loon is kind of seen as Hermit's competition. We can see Hermit comparing the two and showing the differences between humans and animals, especially the loon and Hermit himself when it comes to fishing. And yeah, and how the loon is more equipped for hunting. Hold on, my phone is really glitchy. Andrew broke my phone.
I did not.
It's so bad. Okay. So the purpose of this section, I thought, was to show the reader how similar humans are to animals, or how similar animals are to humans, but it also goes through like the differences as well, and it shows like connections between the two. And yeah, the two being Hermit and the loon that goes out there to keep him company. So some quotes that support my little thing, my little claim, is the first one in the section. It says, sometimes I had a companion in my fishing who came through the village to my house from the other side of town, and the catching of the dinner was as much as a social exercise as the eating of it, meaning that they both worked just like hard to get the fish. The second one is, while he was thinking one thing in his brain, I was endeavoring to divine his thought in mine. It was a pretty game, played on the smoother surface of a pond, a man against a loon. And that little thing at the end that says a man against a loon kind of shows like the competition between the two to get the fish. The third one is, says, and then no wit could divine where in the deep pond beneath the smooth surface he might be speeding his way like a fish, for he had time and ability to visit the bottom of the pond in its deepest part, which shows that the loon had more advantages to fishing, meaning he's able to go actually like in the water and like all that jazz. The quotes support the evidence because it shows the relationship between Hermit and the loon, especially the difference between the hunting skills. In the last quote, Hermit points out the loon has the ability to go far underwater, like going to the deepest part of the pond and to travel at high speeds, while Hermit was unable to. Hermit also stated that it seemed it would be a competition earlier. He stated a man against a loon, knowing that they were both after the same thing, which was the fish. Something that I thought it was done really good. Something that I think was done really well and that I agree with is how the relationship between animals and humans is so similar but so different, showing like the differences with their hunting skills, but they were both after the same thing. That's it.
Hermit should have just caught me. For now.
Hey Andrew, there's still a remote I can check your head.
Not as bad as these. And I have thousands of these.
It's okay, Andrew, shut up. Housewarming. Andrew, shut up. No one needs your opinion. Okay.
Good start, good start.
My section was on housewarming. Love that we're just not switching to the next one. Okay, hold on.
Why'd you break that?
And I think it just doesn't like me.
That's fair. I mean, try taking another presentation mode and just.
Yeah, well, I took it out, but now it's like black.
Oh.
Okay, I'm gonna try. It's only me that can break it.
Yeah.
Okay, so basically, not a lot happened in this chapter. It was just he was preparing his house and himself for winter, and he was like picking chestnuts and grapes and building a fireplace. And he was very fascinated about this pond that like froze over, and he was just kind of like, you kind of just learned a lot about his personality, I think, and he was kind of like kooky and weird. And then I think the purpose was to show like change and adaptation, not only because you're watching like the season change, but he's also changing throughout the storyline as he's preparing for winter. Okay. Anyways, so I have two quotes. And the first one is, some of my friends spoke as if I was coming to the woods on purpose to freeze myself. This one goes to my point of how he's a little different, kooky. Even his friends think that, and not just us reading it. And then the second one, it is so much pleasanter and wholesomer to be warmed by the sun while you can be than by an artificial fire. I thus warmed myself by the still glowing embers which the summer, like a departed hunter, had left. That one was like, it's a lot of words. And it shows the narrator's attachment to summer and how winter and the artificial fire is subpar. And then this chapter didn't have anything really for me to agree or disagree on, because it was really just him collecting fruit and staring at a pond. So that's it.
Why are your slides complicated?
I got it off the internet, literally.
Alright, so my section was winter animals. So what happened in this chapter was that in winter animals, or how do you pronounce his name? Or how do you pronounce his name? Thoreau. Was about Thoreau, and he removes himself from society and chooses to live in the wilderness. He preferred the natural compact of, or company of animals, the different species of their own habit. He preferred the natural compact of the animals, the different species of their own habits and personality. So he just analyzed how they were, how they acted, paid attention to the characteristics, which made him curious about if animals have their own populations like us humans do, so have their own contributing society. So what was the purpose of this chapter? The main purpose of this was Thoreau seeking self-resilience and solitude in this journey of his. So by going to the forest or with the winter animals was his way of doing that. He moved to the woods by Walden Pond outside of Concord, Massachusetts. He lived there for 2 years while writing a book before returning. And this book, all he did was talk about his experiences with nature and says how man doesn't need to work as hard as we do. And he says that it's actually really simple and easy if we chose to follow our own instincts. So basically not worrying too much about life or not focusing so hard. These are the quotes that are fine, and they're all the same because they all tie into the same idea of him paying attention to the wildlife and how he wanted to respect the animals by examining their behavior and feelings. And one example of this would be, sometimes I heard the foxes as they ranged over the snow crust in the moonlight nights in search of a partridge or other game, barking raggedly and demonically like forest dogs, as if laboring with some anxiety or seeking expression, struggling for light and to be dogged outright, to run freely in the streets, for if we take the ages to our account, may there not be civilization going on amongst brutes as well as men. So as we could tell, he actually paid a lot of detail and gave up a lot of his attention to the animals in the forest that he was living with, because he was in the forest and he was also examining them. So whether if I agree or disagree, I actually kind of agree that the wilderness can be a peaceful place, and that's where you could also find some solitude or find some way to find yourself, or basically just find yourself or put yourself in a journey. Personally, I wouldn't spend my time doing that just for self-resilience or to improve myself, because the forest could be dangerous and you never know what you could run into. But other than that, it's a really unique way of respecting animals by analyzing their behavior and choosing to live your own life for your own journey. And that is it.
I'll give you the day, basically. I'll give you 1 day of excuses, okay? It's only 2% anyways, but still I'll give you the fact, but
it's a wrap.
Hey, this is my dog Pina. Anyways, okay. My presentation was about Walden Spring. My section is about the route watching spring arrive. The ice that was located on the Walden Pond was the pond that took the longest to melt because it was a very deep pond. He explained how he would hear the ice rumble. This ice rumbling was from the transition to spring. It was getting hotter and the ice was melting. He would enjoy seeing nature transition, and he was celebrating how light it was getting and how the warmth was coming. He enjoyed most of the animals beginning to move around and the other birds returning to nature. He then left Walden because he felt like his mission was done and that he'd experienced everything necessary for that trip. The purpose of this was to show that the route is very fascinated by the ice on the pond and how it changes to spring. He experienced spiritually enriching events. He believes that spring is proof of immortality. He states that nature can have an effect in our source of life. He believes it can have a change in our soul. These are my supporting quotes. So I believe that these quotes support the purpose because it really shows the process of how just spring can help you have a change of heart and attitude, and to have a new, better soul, as he said. It proves that nature does help calm the body down with spring. You can still feel the joy and happiness of a blessed new day. So the first quote is basically how he's just saying like an example of, say your neighbor is like a really bad person, but then like he sees like the sun is shining really bright and it's warm in the morning, and he's just like recreating the world and just forgetting about everything and focused on spring and how all his faults are forgotten. So overall, I agree with everything that Thoreau was believing, because when it's a good day outside with fresh air, perfect weather, sun out, it just changes your attitude and makes you believe that the day will be good. However, if it is super hot and humid, people tend to be more grumpy and more bothered by things easier because they aren't comfortable. So I can agree with him that nature is the source of life.